In episode 1 of Sweet Tooth, we have to start off before the Great Crumble. Life is just as we know it now, not pandemic-wise. And the first main character we get introduced to is Dr. Singh. He's a doctor in a hospital, has a wife, everything's going normally. Until all of a sudden somebody comes in really sick. Her pinky is twitching for no reason, and her sickness never gets better. In fact, it gets worse. And this turns into a pandemic. And much like the coronavirus, it goes worldwide. But people don't handle this pandemic as well as they did the coronavirus. It's basically all-out chaos. And for Dr. Singh, he tries to live life as normal, but that's really difficult. He's working all day and night trying to find a cure for this thing with no luck. And then his wife comes down with it. He knows he needs to get her to his hospital, which isn't the easiest thing because there's panic in the streets, but he is able to do so. He admits her, he continues to work, he's exhausted when all of a sudden a nurse comes to him and says, "Are you a doctor? Because I have something you need to see." And she escorts him through the nursery where people are consoling each other. And that's when he sees the reason why. Because when he gets to the NICU, all the newborn babies are half human, half animal. And no one knows what came first, the H5G9 virus or what was dubbed the hybrids. This became the greatest mystery of the 21st century. But while all that chaos was going on, one father of a hybrid child was heading into the wilderness, Yosemite National Park to be exact. He wanted to get away from all of it. The father knew that life would be dangerous for the hybrid child, so he was able to find a cabin, fix it up, and fence them in, completely going off the grid. And that's where him and his half-human, half-deer son named Gus grew up. The years went on and Gus said his first words. He called the man Pubba. The man made his own books for Gus of the children's classics that we all know and love. And as far as Gus the child was concerned, he was living a normal life because ignorance was bliss. But no matter how hard the father tried to keep the outside world away, sometimes he couldn't. One example of this is when a plane flies overhead and dumps a bunch of flyers promoting a sanctuary for the hybrids. Luckily for the father, Gus was too young at the time to understand what was going on, so the man was able to get rid of all the flyers. As the years went on, though, Gus got more and more curious on what was on the other side of the fence. The man had promised he would tell Gus one day when he was old enough, and at the age of 7, Gus persists, and finally the man gives in. He used an example of an apple in a jar with a bunch of ants. The ants posing as human beings destroying the apple, which was supposed to be the world. He said the ants, i.e. the people, got greedy, so Mother Nature decided to create a sickness and get rid of as many of the people as she could. Then all of a sudden, a miracle happened. The hybrids. Gus's type. No one knows where exactly hybrids came from, but all the people that survived got terrified of them because they were different. Because of the fact that some of those bad people are still out there, it's Pubba's job to keep Gus safe. Gus then mentions out of the blue that he saw his mother. What he really saw was a doe. The man doesn't know this, though. He does let Gus know, "I know that wasn't your mother because your mother's gone, Gus." But later that night, the father figures that these questions might persist. So he grabs a lockbox of a bunch of items from the outside world, including a photo of Gus's real mother. He heads to a tree and he buries it. The years continue to go on. Gus continues to grow up. He gets birthday gifts like a slingshot. But one particular day, he sees the doe's footprints, and he's still convinced that the doe is his mother. So he follows them all the way to the fence, where he finds that the fence has been destroyed by a fallen tree. So Gus gets gutsy. He crosses the fence to see what happens. And when nothing does, he's a little relieved. But because he's a deer, his hearing is very heightened. So he starts to hear some predators and he gets scared. And when he turns around, his father is standing there, frantic. He grabs Gus and races him back to the cabin, freaking out because somebody could have seen him. And Gus responds to this by telling him, "You lie to me. You don't tell me anything." Gus then runs off and cries in his bed, and the man feels bad about what he did, but he knows it was necessary. And then all of a sudden, he hears somebody yelling the name Sarah, and he gets really scared. He grabs a broom handle, pretending it's a gun, and follows the voice to find a man outside of the fence claiming that his sister had come through that area about a week and a half ago, and he just wanted to make sure she got through safely. The father claims, though, that no one came through, so you probably should get on the road. And the man from behind the fence says, "The road is the last place you want to be. You haven't gotten out of here lately, have you? Because it sucks out here. There's no rules and no laws, and once the internet went down, it was basically over. The world has just become tribes of people who are fighting over what's left." The father asks the man from a distance what happened to the sick, and the man says, "Well, it's slowed down, but it is still out there." He then says, "Well, if you're out here, you're probably not out here alone." And the father flips out, saying, "I have been out here for 9 years by myself." But then Gus, who is hiding right next to his Pubba, makes a noise. And the father looks down, but when he looks back up, the man in the fence is gone, and what's left is a bunch of ribbons marking the area. The father knows that he doesn't have a lot of time until more people show up, so he races Gus back to the cabin, telling him to hide under steps and not to come out until he hears his voice. He then grabs a box with a hazard sign under the floorboards, pulls out a syringe, and tapes it to his stick, and then he heads out. And Gus does as he's told. He sits under the steps like Harry Potter, sucking down maple syrup, which is his favorite food, but then all of a sudden he hears a noise. And he gets curious, so when he gets out of the steps, he doesn't find his father. What he finds is that doe, who has broken into the cabin. Gus approaches it, and the doe is licking his hand, but then all of a sudden they hear a scream. The doe frantically gets out of the cabin, and Gus initially hides, but then curiosity gets the best of him, so he does leave the cabin with his slingshot. He's ready to fight off any intruder, but it's not an intruder. It's his father who has returned, although his father is in rough shape. He tells Gus, "You're safe now," but then he collapses, and it leaves Gus to drag the father back into the cabin, put him in bed, and try to nurse him back to health. The issue is, the man's pinky is twitching. He's got the sick. Of course, Gus doesn't know this, so he continues to try to get his father better, but the father knows it's a lost cause. One morning, Gus gets up, and his father is in even worse shape. Pubba tells Gus, "Your mother was like me, Gus. Her name was Birdie, and you were her life. But we got separated, and I brought you here to the woods." The father then reiterates the rules that he's created for Gus. What happens if Gus hears a growl? What happens if Gus sees a human? And he makes Gus promise that Gus will never pass the fence. He then sends Gus to go get breakfast, but when Gus returns, the man has passed away. At the age of 10, Gus is left all alone to fend for himself. Luckily, the man has done a pretty good job of training him for this. Gus buries the father and creates a whole family of animals and even a scarecrow from kindling he's found outside in the woods. But as the days go on, life becomes harder and harder. Things start breaking down, and Gus gets frustrated at this. One particular day, he's trying to uproot what looks like a miniature tree, and he gets so frustrated that he tries to burn it, but the fire gets out of control. And instead of trying to extinguish it, Gus decides to throw his straw family in the fire, which sets the blaze up even higher. Gus goes so far as to throw the stuffed dog that his father had made for him around the age of like 5 as a birthday present. He throws that in the fire, but then quickly thinks twice about it, runs it back to the cabin to put the fire out. And Gus is just a typical 10-year-old who's frustrated. He doesn't know what to do. And as he's lying on his bed, he notices that his father has taped a map to the ceiling. And that map has a heart written on it with an arrow pointing to a tree. So Gus follows the map. He finds a tree with a heart carved into it, an arrow pointing down to the ground, and when Gus digs, he finds that lockbox. Most of the items in it are stuff Gus doesn't understand. Credit cards, money, he tosses all that stuff aside. But what does catch his eye is the lone pamphlet that's left for the preserve and a picture of his real mother. He notices that in the corner of it, it says RR Colorado. And that's Gus's first clue as to where Birdie might be. He races back to the cabin, flips over a map, and figures out where he'd have to go to get to Colorado. So with these clues, Gus has decided to pack up some of his stuff and try to get to Colorado to see Birdie. But right as he gets to the edge of the fence, he sees a candy bar on the ground. When he opens it up, he starts chomping on it, and he likes it a lot. He then sees another one, but when he goes to grab that one, that candy bar is on a string, and it's pulled away. And then out of nowhere, an arrow shoots out of the woods, and Gus runs to hide. He knows he's in danger, and it doesn't take long for one of the poachers to grab him. As the two poachers are talking about what they're planning on doing with him, Gus uses his antlers to hurt one of them and free himself. But the poacher gets so frustrated, he points his bow at Gus, and then all of a sudden, the poacher gets shot with a gun. The noise startles Gus. He's never heard a bang like that before. But then he slowly backs up, and then you see the person who shot the poacher. It's this big, huge guy, and Gus is terrified. The guy with the gun, though, scares off the other poacher because the poacher brought a bow and arrow to a gunfight. Gus, however, runs back to his cabin, setting up some traps and hiding under the stairs, just like he did previously. And it doesn't take long for this big guy to show up. And since Gus isn't exactly Kevin from Home Alone, the traps don't do much, and the man finds Gus pretty easily. But when he grabs him and throws him out from under the steps, Gus says stay away, and that completely catches the big guy off guard, because he's never heard a hybrid talk before. He asks him, "Who taught you how to speak?" And Gus says, "My pubba, and he's going to be back, and he's bigger than you, and he's going to scare you off." The man then lets Gus know you shouldn't set fires in the daytime because I could see that smoke from 20 miles out. The big man then exits the cabin and starts fixing up some of the stuff around that Gus couldn't fix himself. All the while, Gus is shooting this guy with his slingshot. Although the big man is annoyed, he's not deterred. He starts giving Gus tips on what he should plant, how to keep birds away from the crops. And it's become clear to the big man that Gus is all alone. No matter how much he claims that his father is coming back, he's dead. The man asks Gus, "Did your father leave you with a name?" But Gus says, "I said go." And the man chuckles and says, "All right, keep that edge, Sweet Tooth. Just remember, good poachers don't miss." And then the guy turns around to leave. But as he's walking out, Gus yells, "How far's Colorado?" And the man says, "It's far. You should stay here because people out there hunt kids like you. Don't make it easy for them." But up until this point, Gus had been told that he was the only kid of his kind. And the man lets him know there are a bunch of people like you. He then asks Gus, "What's in Colorado?" And Gus says, "My mama." And the big man tells Gus, if you go out there alone, they'll have your head mounted to a wall by morning. So stay put. He then turns around and leaves, saying, "So long, Sweet Tooth," and heads back out. But a short time after that, Gus starts thinking about what if his preconceived notions about the outside world are wrong. So he grabs some of his items and races after the guy, breaking all of his father's rules at once, hopping over the fence and tracking the big man down. And it takes a while, but he finally finds him, and he yells from a mountaintop, "Big man, take me." But in episode 2, the big man doesn't agree to take Gus along with him. Gus just continues to follow him. The big man thinks he gets rid of Gus by throwing trash all over the forest because Gus was told to clean up after yourself. But as the big man settles down for camp that night and he's eating food, he hears rustling from behind him. He knows it's Gus and he says, "Come out where I can see you." And Gus starts peppering him with questions, which just annoys him. To the point where the big man says, "Look, kid, guys like me aren't great for kids like you." The questions, though, persist and the big man gets tired of it, so he just turns over to go to sleep. But when he does that, Gus notices that there's a bunch of food hanging out of the big man's backpack, and he can't help himself. So when the big man wakes up the next morning, Gus has eaten most of his food, chewed up a map, and, more importantly, taking his prescription meds, which infuriates the big man. But Gus says, "Not to worry, I know where we can get food." And he points to a cabin way up top in the mountains. So the two head up there. The big man tells Gus, "You head in, I'll keep lookout from outside." And when Gus heads in, it's a visitor center for the park. Gus is looking at some knickknacks and whatnot, but then all of a sudden he gets really freaked out because this place is a bunch of deer heads mounted on the wall, just like the big man said. And as Gus tries to get out of there, he gets caught in a trap. When the trap goes off, a boy around Gus's age named Rusty comes out and says, "Dad, you should take a look at this." And Gus screams at them, "You're not going to put my head on a wall." And in fact, they're not. It's actually a really good family who invite Gus and the big man in to share their food. Although they are a little concerned. The whole family wears masks because they haven't been out in a while. The big man lets them know, though, you guys can take your masks off because I don't have the sick and he can't transmit it. The family takes their masks off, but then the mother sends Rusty to his room. And when she does that, Gus asks the woman, "Are you Rusty's mama?" Because Gus has never seen a mother before. They're more surprised that Gus talks. So she answers his question with a question, saying, "Who taught you how to talk?" And he says, "My pubba. He had me do school." Gus then shows the woman a picture of his mom and says, "Do you know Birdie? Because we're trying to find her." But of course, she doesn't. Eventually, the husband asks, "Well, how do you two know each other?" And at the same exact time, Gus says, "He's taking me to Colorado," and the big man says, "We don't." The group continues to talk, and you find out that Gus and Rusty are really close in age. Rusty's 1 year older than him. And Rusty was one of the last kids to be born until every kid born was a hybrid. Rusty, though, has never interacted with kids his own age. And while the mother was a little concerned about Rusty hanging out with a hybrid, she has a giant smile on her face looking at the joy of her son playing with another boy his age. While the mother was checking up on her son, the husband was chatting with the big man. He actually recognized the big man because the big man, whose actual name is Tommy, used to be a football star before the giant crumble. Eventually, though, the husband does ask, "What do you want from us?" And Tommy says, "I want to spend the night, and then after that, we're leaving." Little do they know, though, on the outside, there are poachers who have found Tommy's camp from the night before, and they are hot on their trail. Inside the tourist center, though, the kids continue to play. Gus gets introduced to music, which he loves, and then the kids head off to bed. Tommy, though, takes some of their food, trading it for a new type of currency called MRE tokens, which you can use to trade in for military food. The mother, though, isn't concerned with Tommy taking her food. The mother is concerned with what the hell is Tommy doing with Gus. And Tommy says, I'm trying to get rid of him, which is easier said than done. But the woman's concerned because she saw a mark on Tommy, which indicated to her that he was a pretty bad dude. Tommy, though, claims he's not like that anymore. He did what he had to do to survive. But she starts questioning him. How many people did you kill? Did they deserve it? Are you coming for my family? Are you coming for my child? But Tommy yells at her, I came here for food. That's it. The conversation, though, then gets back to Gus, where she says, you know he thinks you're going to look out for him. And Tommy says, if it were up to me, there would be no kids like him. And she questions him on that, saying, why did you save him then? And Tommy says, does it really matter? Here, I've got an idea. How about you take him? He's better off here than out there, and let's be real, you're the closest thing to a mother he's ever going to have. And the mother inside her seriously considers this. She then, though, goes and tucks the kids in. But as she's tucking in Gus, she sees the actual picture of Birdie that he'd shown her earlier, but she didn't really look at. And she sees the RR Colorado, and she says, is your mom in Red Rocks? Because she's familiar with that location. She used to go listen to music there all the time. But Red Rocks is the latest clue on where Gus can find Birdie. She then tucks Gus in and says, I want to talk to you both in the morning. And then she lets them sleep. But Gus can't sleep. He gets up in the middle of the night and goes out to the tourist center where he sees Tommy leaving. And he says, are we leaving? But he quickly realizes they aren't leaving. Tommy is. Before Tommy can leave, though, they hear rustling outside, and it's the poachers. And Tommy asks Gus, how many are there? Because Gus has that sixth sense ability, but Gus can't figure it out because it's raining. He just knows that there's a lot of them. The screaming of the poachers, though, wakes up the entire family. The poachers yell, we're not here for your family or you, but we have reason to believe you're harboring a hybrid child. Because of this, it gives us the right to come in there under Abbott's code. So you can either surrender the hybrid child peacefully or we're coming in. Now, at this point, the husband and wife are telling Gus to be quiet. But then right before the poachers actually come in the building, Tommy, swinging a bear trap, takes most of them out, everyone except one, who does come in the tourist center looking for Gus. But Gus isn't willing to sit back and hide. He uses a slingshot to distract the guy and even stabs him in the leg. But as Gus is staring this guy down, Gus holding a slingshot, the poacher holding a tranquilizer gun, the poacher gets distracted because right behind Gus, outside of the tourist center, is a giant stag. And this distraction gives Tommy enough time to take the guy out. At this point, though, it's become clear to the family that they can't keep Gus. Doing so would put their own family in harm. So they tell Tommy, sorry, man, but you're going to have to keep him. They put both Tommy and Gus in the chairlift and send them on their way. And on the ride down, Gus tells Tommy, you don't have to come to Colorado with me. I'll do it myself. And Tommy strikes a deal with him, saying, I'll tell you what, I'll take you to the next town, and then we're done from there. But as they're having this conversation, they're unknowingly being watched by 3 people dressed as animals. Now, in this episode, you also get an update on Dr. Singh. He's currently living in a gated community that runs on solar energy, and he's living there with his wife. His wife seems perfectly healthy, but then all of a sudden her fingers start twitching, and he goes in the pantry and grabs an antidote. He injects her, but he's running low, so he's going to have to go to the local doctor, and he does so on horseback. When he arrives at the doctor's office, which is a converted restaurant, he checks in, and as he's sitting to get admitted, soldiers arrive with what appears to be more medicine. And Dr. Singh gets uncomfortable. It's as if he's having flashbacks, but he snapped out of it when the nurse says, the doctor will see you now. And as soon as Dr. Singh walks in, the actual doctor knows what he's there for, saying, you need a refill? The doctor then starts getting Dr. Singh a new refill, but then starts questioning him on how the latest dose took with his wife. How long was she in remission for? Were there any side effects? That sort of thing. Right before he leaves, though, she hands him a book and says, these are all my records. Detailed documentation of everything that I've given your wife. Which trial versions have worked, which ones haven't. And she's giving him this because her medical days are over. The world has focused so much of their time for finding a cure that they've ignored things like cancer. And she's pretty sure she's got stage 4 breast cancer. The problem is Dr. Singh has given up medicine. But the doctor reminds him, you don't really have a choice. And I know you'll take up my work because you'll do anything to keep your wife alive. And this is really the only way to do so. So Dr. Singh takes the book and starts looking through it, but he finds some troubling information. And when he gets home, it's obvious to his wife that something is bothering him. He informs his wife that he now has to take over the practice because the old doctor is taking off. And his wife is thrilled about that because who better to take care of her than her own husband? But he says, no, you don't understand. Some of the things she's been doing goes against everything we believe in. And that's when the wife picks up the book and starts skimming through it. And she sees exactly what Dr. Singh was talking about. We also get introduced to a third character named Amy, Before the big crumble, Amy was a therapist, listening to people's problems all day and night. But when the virus really hit, Amy just hid out in her office. And she hid out there for a long time until it was safe, or as safe as it could be. And when she finally left, the streets were completely deserted. She heard a noise coming from the distance, but when the noise got closer, it was elephants. And this gave Amy an idea: head to the zoo. So she did so. And that's where she lived. Way happier living in a zoo than working the 9-to-5 job that she had. But then all of a sudden she hears something outside of the zoo, goes to examine it, and it's a hybrid half-human, half-pig left in a crate. Tommy and Gus continue to make their way to the next town, and at one point, Gus notices some purple flowers and makes mention of it. And Tommy lets him know that those flowers usually indicate that the sick have been there or are nearby. Right before they get to town, Tommy makes camp in an old school bus that he usually hides out some items in. And the item that he needs is his meds. And Gus actually knew that he had meds in the bus because he could smell it. He mentions this to Tommy, and Tommy had no idea that he also had a heightened sense of smell. Tommy takes his meds, though, and the two are eating under the stars, and Gus says to him, "Were you really going to leave me with that family?" And Tommy says, "Don't ask questions that you don't want the answers to, kid." It's kind of a downer. So, to boost Gus's spirits, Tommy says, "Hey, you know what we do tomorrow? We go to the market." And you know what's at the market? A train that is heading to Colorado. This definitely boosts Gus' spirits before he goes to sleep. But when he does so, he has a nightmare that he wakes up in the bus and he's all alone in the dead of winter. And he's yelling, "Jep, Jep," because that's what he calls Tommy. Tommy's last name's Jeopard, but Tommy's not answering. And when Gus wakes up, he's very relieved that the first thing he sees is Tommy packing up to go. And Tommy knows that you can't just walk into the market with a hybrid child, so what he's done is he's made him a helmet. And he tells Gus, "We're going to pretend that you're a regular boy pretending to be a hybrid so you don't attract any unwanted attention." He tells Gus we have to do this because the last men, the guys that tried to snatch you at the visitor center, they're going to be there and they're going to be on the lookout. So don't do any weird deer shit. Gus takes the helmet that Tommy's made him and they start walking towards the market. But Gus starts making light of the situation and Tommy has to stop him and say, "Kid, this is no laughing matter. This is serious. If you don't blend in, you're not going to make it." He comes up with a set of rules that Gus has to abide by. The main one being, if somebody thinks he's a hybrid, start talking, because no one's ever seen a talking hybrid before. The other main rule is to keep his ears under control. They then make their way to the market, and Gus is pretty scared of all of the soldiers that he's seeing, because he thinks that they're the last men. Tommy reassures him, though, you don't have to be scared of them. Just keep walking. He then bribes a guard with AA batteries as to not search them, and they get in the market. And it's a little sensory overload for Gus. He is mesmerized by everything he's seeing in there. At one point, Gus actually gets away from Tommy, and he finds free samples for apples, and he starts going in on them. To the point where the person has to say, "You gotta pay for that." And Tommy ends up finding him, paying off the debt, but grabbing him and saying, "All right, kid, you gotta stop eating like that. It's weird. Here, sit down on this bench. I'm gonna go get your train ticket. Do not move. Do not talk to anybody. Don't do a thing until I come back." And when Tommy goes to the ticket booth, he's surprised to learn that the price of the ticket has gone up. So he has to bargain with the guy, give the last of his MRE tokens and an extra pair of shoelaces in order to get Gus's ticket. But when he gets back to the bench, Gus is nowhere to be found. Curiosity got the best of Gus, and it started off by looking at a map of Colorado. But then he heard some kids laughing, and he decided to follow them out. And just like Gus, these kids are dressed up like hybrids. But unlike his friend Rusty, these kids aren't very friendly. And Gus finds this out when they're playing a carnival game, and they're using some very anti-hybrid language. And then all of a sudden, they notice Gus. And they're not the only group that's noticed Gus. Gus has unknowingly created some unwanted attention. There's a girl that's following him as well. And when he gets scared of the group of kids, he backs up right into the girl. And he just blurts out, "I'm just a regular human boy, I can talk." And she chuckles and says, "I can see that." She then touches Gus's ears, and when he gives a reaction, it confirms her suspicions that Gus is a hybrid. She asks him, "Are you here alone?" And Gus lies and says, "Yes." "Okay, well, follow me." And he starts to, but then Tommy intercepts, grabbing him and scolding him for running off. He tries to plead his case, saying that she was helping him, but Tommy doesn't really want to hear it. And the girl, seeing Tommy grab Gus, just disappears. Now, it's worth mentioning that this girl came from an amusement park that's not too far away, and she lives there with a bunch of other kids. They use the VR simulations in the park to train for combat, and one day they're doing so when all of a sudden, an emergency alert goes off saying there's a hybrid in distress. Animal Army, to your stations. And that hybrid is Gus. And this girl, who appears to be the leader, says to the group, all right, folks, you know what to do. So this girl is going to have to wait to get Gus alone again, because Tommy and Gus are headed to the train. But as they're standing in line, Gus says to Tommy, hey, those soldiers over there, they have your medicine. And it's a bunch of soldiers loading up some crates to go to a supply train. And Tommy's in desperate need of some pills. He tried to get some earlier at the doctor in the market, only to find out that that doctor was shut down for whatever reason. So he says to Gus, hey, we have one more thing to do. And him and Gus go and break into the supply car. And with the help of Gus, they're able to locate the box that the meds are in. But they're caught. Although Tommy makes really quick work of that soldier, and after grabbing the meds, they get out of there. But as they're fleeing, they get caught by another soldier, and this guy has a shotgun. Tommy, though, fights him off, but the gun blast goes off, and it forces Gus's ears to twitch, and the guy notices that Gus is a real-life hybrid. So Tommy is forced to knock him out. But at this point, Tommy knows that he has to get Gus on that train ASAP, not just because it's leaving in a few minutes, but because they're close to getting their cover blown. So Gus and Tommy run towards the train, and Tommy puts him on the step, but then all of a sudden, the soldier that was knocked out has woken up and alerts everybody that that child right there is a hybrid. Tommy and Gus end up getting arrested. Tommy and Gus are blindfolded and are escorted through the woods when all of a sudden, the soldiers that are escorting them are attacked out of nowhere. Tommy goes to protect Gus, and out of the woods, those people that were dressed up in the animal garb that watched Tommy and Gus head down the chairlift save them. And they reveal themselves, and it's the kids from the amusement park. But as Gus and Tommy were being escorted through the woods, at a base not too far away, a soldier approaches General Abbott and says, sir, I think we found her. And General Abbott tells him, tell the men to get ready to move. And it just so happens that General Abbott has one of those flyers that was dumped on Gus and his father years ago for that preserve that was promising medicine and shelter. Now, over with Dr. Singh, he has taken over the medical practice. And he mentions into his recorder that he has regained the love of medicine, helping people. Yet every day when he goes to find a cure, he's reminded why he quit. And that's because the questionable experimentation that was going on to find a cure was done so on hybrids. Not just hybrids, but children hybrids as well. Dr. Singh ends up getting his first shipment of medical supplies from the soldiers, but when he opens it up, it's nothing but medical supplies. There's no vaccine, there's no vials, there's nothing. And he is really frustrated about that. This burden is weighing on him, and the next day when Ronnie reminds him that they have a party at a neighbor's house for Survivor's Day, he doesn't want to go. It's not just because he doesn't like parties. He tells Ronnie, you're not 100%. But she reminds him that the last vaccine hasn't worn off yet. And if they don't go, it's going to raise a bunch of red flags. They get into a little bit of a fight about this situation where Ronnie says to him, we both know why the medicine you're giving me isn't working right now, and it's because you're not following the steps that the last doctor gave you, i.e. experimenting on hybrids. This really pisses off Dr. Singh, and Ronnie can tell, so she says, but if there is a humane way to do it, you're the guy to do it. Either way, though, they head off to the party, and one of the reasons they feel the need that they have to go is because the last guy who blew off a party ended up getting his house burnt by the community. So they come up with a code word to get out of there, just in case something happens. They go to the party, they're having as good of a time as you can, they're playing charades, but the whole time, Dr. Singh is keeping a close eye on his wife's pinky, and when it acts up, he covers it with his own hand and gives the code word to her to get out of there. But before they can, the host of the party makes a speech about his wife who died from the sick. And right after that speech, the same host drops a jar of tomatoes, and as he cleans it up, that really nosy neighbor that everybody has and calls Karen behind her back is trying to help him out, and she notices that his pinky is twitching. He tries to play it off like it's nothing and everybody's had some drinks, but everybody gets freaked out. They back up from him, they cover their mouth with bandanas, and they strap him to a chair. And this Karen, who is in charge of the neighborhood watch, goes so far as to hand Dr. Singh a test to administer right on the spot. So Dr. Singh does it, and it comes up positive for the sick. So the group of neighbors end up taping him to this chair, heading out of the house, and then lighting the house on fire. And they all just watch it burn, knowing that their neighbor is inside. Episode 4 picks up right after the kids attack the caravan of last men that were taking Gus and Tommy to God knows where. All of the kids adopt the name of their favorite animals, so the leader of the group is known as Bear. And she tells Gus, we're not here to hurt you, we're here to free you. You can go anywhere you want, just get away from him, and she points to Tommy. Bear then notices that Tommy's still alive, and she asks why. And Tiger says, well, he was tied up with Gus, and besides, Nobody makes a move without your order, right? There's definitely a power struggle going on. So Bear gives the command to shoot Tommy, but when she does that, Gus ends up giving him a hug, getting in the way of both Tommy and the gun. And while this is unprecedented because they've never left a survivor, Bear decides to take them both back because they've also never met a hybrid who can talk. So they bring both of them back to the amusement park, but as they're distracting Gus with the glitz and the glamour of the place, they take Tommy elsewhere. Bear starts telling Gus how she started the animal army, and when you join it, you draw your animal on the wall. And he's taking this all in, but then he notices that he's doing so without his friend, Jep. And he says, "Where's Jep?" And she tells him, "Don't worry, no one's going to do anything to him unless I give an order." She then takes him to the arcade part of the amusement park where all of the animal army are staring at Gus, amazed. And when he says hi, they go nuts. Bear proclaims that Gus is the king of the day, which means that all the kids line up and give him their favorite things, like gummy worms. And Gus then gets some backstory on the animal army. Because the animal army is a lot like Gus's father. They don't believe that the hybrids brought along the sick. In fact, they believe the hybrids are curing the earth because man was just busy destroying it. So they've made it their mission to protect the hybrids at all costs. Gus asks them, why aren't there any grown-ups here? And Bear says, well, grown-ups killed my family. Specifically, last men. Since then, they've learned how to take care of themselves. The distraction of Gus, though, continues when they take him to the bumper cars. And as he's having the time of his life, Tiger comes up to Bear and says, we're not going to be able to hold Tommy forever. He's really big. Why is he even alive again? And Bear asserts her authority once again, saying, do I have to remind you who's in charge? We need to figure out why a hybrid is so connected with his poacher. Until I figure that out, we're not doing anything with him. And shortly after that, Bear goes about trying to find the answer to that question. Through general conversation, Gus tells her that he's trying to get to Colorado to find his mom, and Jep was helping him do that. And she says, well, if Jep was helping you, why aren't you in Colorado now? And Gus reminds her, it's because we got caught. Remember, you saved us? He then shows her a picture of Birdie, and she has their tech guy comb the internet to try to find out any information about a birdie from Red Rocks, Colorado. She tries to extract some more information about Gus and Tommy's relationship, so she says that when she was his age, she used to get so excited to see another person that she would forget that there are bad people out there because she just wanted a friend. And Gus says, well, Tommy's my friend. And that's the last straw for Bear. She tells Gus, Tommy is a last man. He's the kind of guy that tried to take you. That's why you should stay with us. But instead of agreeing to it, Gus demands to see Tommy. So they take him to him. And Tommy is tied up and bound in another part of the park. And Bear asks Tommy, why didn't you tell Gus the truth about who you really are? And Tommy admits, yes, I was a last man, but I'm not anymore. People can change. And Gus is a little taken aback. He says, you were like those people in the market? Why didn't you just tell me that? And Tommy says, it's not that simple, kid. You guys don't remember what it was like when the sick hit. You had to choose sides. It was either kill or be killed. But Bear screams back at him, how many families did you break apart? How many kids like Gus did you make disappear? But Gus sticks up for Tommy. He tells her, Tommy's not like those people. He protected me. He bought me things he thought I'd like. He never tried to sell me. He tried to help me. And Tommy's a little surprised about this and says, kid, did you hear what I just said? Get out of here while you can. Go find your mom. But instead of doing that, Gus just gives Tommy a hug. And that's when Bear gives the order, take him away. But Gus freaks out at her, yelling, you promised. They end up taking Tommy, though, to another part of the park. And they have him tied up in front of a crate that has a tiger in it. The only thing keeping the tiger from Tommy is the crate door opening and the members of the animal army who are trying to hold the tiger back as much as they can. The whole animal army is pumped for this moment. And Bear raises her animal skull, which indicates to everybody to shut up. She starts to give a speech about how they're all there to execute Tommy for all the wrongdoings that he's done in his life, harming hybrids mainly. She then goes on to explain why everybody joined the animal army to protect hybrids. But then she decides to spare Tommy's life, and that does not sit well with Tiger and a few other members of the army. Tiger actually gives the command to open up the crate, and the actual tiger that's in the crate is trying to get freed up, although the members of the animal army are still holding the chains. Gus realizes that this is going to end really badly for Tommy any moment. So he hops down and gets in between the tiger and Tommy. And he asks the tiger, please don't hurt my friend. And then all of a sudden the tiger goes from being a very vicious animal to being very calm, getting back in the crate. And they just lock the crate back up. But the power struggle between Tiger and Bear has come to a head. It's got members of the animal army fighting amongst themselves. And when Tiger holds up her skull and everybody gets quiet, it's pretty clear that they've chosen a new leader, and it's no longer Bear. Now, during all of this, Gus was able to free Tommy, and the two were able to get out of there. And it turns out Gus is not the only hybrid that can speak, because Amy ended up taking that hybrid pig in and raising her as her own. She gives her the name Wendy, and the two live at the zoo. When she's not tending to gardens and whatnot, Amy spends most of her time listening to the local radio. And that can be pretty dangerous because Wendy is a curious little girl. She overhears Wendy listening to the radio, and she starts asking questions about the last men that Amy doesn't really want to answer. She tells Wendy, go get ready because we're going to go shopping, i.e. they have to go into town to grab some supplies. But as they're coming back, they're almost caught by a patrol of last men. Luckily, though, they're not. They end up getting back to the zoo, locking it up, and they're safe. The next day, Wendy is actually listening to the radio, and she overhears a woman on the other end saying, it's dying. It barely eats. We can't keep hiding it. We need to keep moving, but if the last men see this hybrid, we're dead. Somebody out there, please help. And Wendy's about to talk to her, but Amy intervenes. Amy has a stern rule about not talking on the radio. They then get ready for dinner, and then they go to bed, like any normal night. But they're awoken in the middle of the night when an alarm goes off that Amy has set up. So they start going out to investigate it, and there's a rustling in the bush, and Amy's about to shoot whatever is in that bush, but Wendy gets in the way saying, no, don't, it's my friend, Bobby. And that's when a groundhog hybrid pops out from the bush. And this groundhog can actually talk a little bit, meaning he can say his own name. But at the behest of Wendy, Amy agrees to take Bobby in. And that's when Amy decides to take everybody in, making a radio broadcast telling the world everybody is welcome at the preserve. Now, over with Dr. Singh, he continues to go over the old research, but he refuses to give in to the methods that were used to find a cure. He's about to leave for work one morning, and he's extremely stressed out, and he tells Ronnie, if I just get another month, I know I can crack this. But she tells him, we've been over this. The doctor's notes are unequivocal. We need a living hybrid. And deep down, Dr. Singh knows that she's right. So he says goodbye to her, he grabs his saddle, and he gets ready to head off. But that nosy neighbor, Karen, ends up seeing him and points out a purple flower that has sprouted from their lawn. He ends up killing it, saying how sometimes these things just pop up. But she is the wrong neighbor that you want seeing such a thing. She then asks where Ronnie is, and Dr. Singh lies to her and says, oh, Ronnie's sleeping in. Last night was our anniversary, and we opened up some Marlowe. And then he heads off to work. When he gets there, he starts looking over some of the research, and he's going over the recipe that's needed to create the current iteration of the treatment. He then goes into a cabinet and grabs a flare gun and pulls out the flare that says secret sauce. And he fires it into the sky, and he waits for the shipment to arrive. When he gets home from work that day, he's surprised to see Karen talking to Ronnie. And the reason that Karen wanted to talk to Ronnie is because she wants to institute weekly tests for the sick, including randomized testing. And that's something that Dr. Singh doesn't want to do. They, quote, agree to disagree, saying that it'll go up to a vote. But when Karen mentions to Ronnie about their anniversary, and it's obvious that Ronnie has no idea what they're talking about, it forces the Singhs to come clean with the woman. But she doesn't handle it well at all, yelling at them that they're liars, that she knew something was up, and they're trying to explain that they might have a cure for this thing, but she doesn't want to hear it. She just wants to expose them. And as she's trying to get out of there, Dr. Singh's horse ends up kicking her and killing her. And initially, the doctor in Dr. Singh tries to revive her, but Ronnie gives him a look like, no, don't, because if you do, she's just going to rat us out. So they drag her body back into their house and lock the door. In episode 5, Sweet Tooth and Jep are able to get out of there, and when they get to a place they think is safe, Jep thanks Gus for having his back, and then he teaches him the pound. Tommy then tells Gus that he's planning to go with him to Colorado, and Gus gives him a giant hug. The next step is trying to figure out how to get out of the area they're in, and as they're trying to do so, they come across Bear. Bear is now a bear without a den, if you will. So in a way, she's kind of a free agent, but she asks for a word with Gus, alone. And that's when she gives him the information that her team was able to find on Birdie. It's not much, but it's more than they had. It's an address with the word Go Grow. Bear then says goodbye and heads off, and Gus says, where are you going? And she says, the train. Tommy thinks she's lying, though, saying the train doesn't come around here. But she says, it does, it just doesn't stop. And Gus brings up the fact that they're also headed to the train. And he attempts to mend the bad blood between Bear and Tommy by saying, well, let's all go there. Bear lets them know that in order to get to the train quick, they have to pass through the Valley of Sorrows, which is this valley of very toxic purple flowers. Nobody goes near it unless they have a death wish, but because of this, she knows that the animal army won't be there either. It's also the fastest way to get to the train, so that's where they're headed. As they're walking, Bear asks Gus, "What do you actually know about Birdie?" And Gus says, "I know that she doesn't have antlers, and I know that I was her whole life, so she's got to be looking for me too." Bear tells him sometimes when we prop up a person in our minds, they don't end up living up to who we think they're going to be. This causes a fight between Bear and Tommy, and Gus once again has to remind them that they're on the same team. They then come across a parachute in a tree, and Tommy explains to both of them what a parachute was used for. Gus thinks that this is all just a lie, and that no one would leave such a magical item just lying in a tree. But as Gus is explaining this, behind him is the dead parachute jumper hanging from the tree. And in order to shield this from him, both Bear and Tommy say, "Yeah, you're right, kid, let's just keep walking." And they head to the Valley of Sorrows. As Gus goes ahead, Tommy and Bear start having a conversation where Bear says that just because she's not in the army anymore doesn't mean she's going to stop helping hybrids. But she wants to know what Tommy's motives are. And Tommy basically says, "It's none of your business what my motives are." She then asks him, "Do you honestly think that his mother's alive?" And Tommy says, "It doesn't matter what I think. That kid has hope coming out of every pore of his body. I don't know where he gets it from, but he's got it." A short time after that, they finally arrive at the Valley of Sorrows, and now they have to find out a way to get over the Valley of Sorrows. There's a bridge, but it's not exactly the sturdiest looking bridge. And it might hold Bear and Gus, but it's definitely not holding Tommy's weight. And this causes another fight between Tommy and Bear, and Gus gets sick of it, so he heads up to the bridge. But when Tommy and Bear see him, they try to get him off of it. Although it's too late. He's halfway across. And that's when the bridge starts breaking. Gus is hanging on by one arm, and there's not much that Bear or Tommy can do, because if they cross the bridge, they're going to fall through too. And eventually, the bridge ends up breaking, and Gus ends up falling into the valley. The fall knocks Gus out, and when he's knocked out, he has a dream where he's reunited with Pubba. He explains to his Pubba that he broke his rules, and his Pubba says, "I knew you would. I just wanted you to be that innocent kid forever. But you have more important things to do. There are other kids like you out there, and those other kids are counting on you." His dad escorts him over to a mirror and says, "I see you, and soon the world will see you too." But then all of a sudden, Pubba disappears, and Gus starts banging on the mirror for him, but he doesn't return. What does show up in his place is General Abbott. With fire in his eyes, he says, "So nice to meet you, Gus." And it terrifies Gus. Luckily, he's awoken from this dream when Tommy and Bear get him to the end of the Valley of Sorrows. Bear put on the parachuter outfit to shield her from the flowers, and Tommy draped himself in the parachute. When they get to the end of the valley, they have another fight, and Gus has gotten sick of it. So he does what Tommy taught him to, and he instructs them both to make a fist and pound it out. They keep walking, and it's not long before they find the train tracks, and they hear the train coming. Now, before we get to the update on Dr. Singh, I need to give you an update on the old doctor, Gladys. She's living out her days on a farm when one night she gets a visit from a bunch of last men and their leader, General Abbott. And that's because General Abbott is well aware that Gladys does not have a terminal illness. She was faking it. And she admits as much, saying, "I'm done working for you." He sits her down and explains that there's a second wave coming. And he's the type of person that isn't willing to sit back and let this disease kill him. He wants to go at it full force. And she says, "No, you're the type of person who's a monster." Abbott doesn't really have time to argue, though. So he gets to the point, demanding to know where the book is. And Gladys says, "I left it with my replacement." Now that he has the information he needs, Abbott gets up to leave. But before he does, Gladys says, "They're just kids, and they're going to live long after we're gone, no matter what you do." Abbott then exits the house, where one of the soldiers opens up a case and hands him a syringe that looks an awful lot like the syringe that Gus's dad had when he went after the last men who came looking for him. The soldier then heads into the house, and we're left to believe that he injects Gladys with whatever is in that syringe. Abbott then heads off to find the book. Of course, the book is with Dr. Singh. And Dr. Singh is still going through his research, but he has a slightly bigger issue. Not only is his lawn full of purple flowers, but he also has the body of his dead neighbor, and the other neighbors have noticed that she's missing. They're actually handing out missing posters. When Dr. Singh is asked about if he's seen her or not, he plays dumb, saying, "No, we haven't seen her since the party." When he gets back in the house, he hands Ronnie the missing poster, and he's freaking out a little bit, but his wife reminds him, "We didn't do anything. The horse killed her. He then gets a message from the clinic letting him know that he has a delivery at the clinic, and this is the delivery he's been waiting for. So both him and Ronnie hop on their horse and head to the office. When they arrive, they're surprised because the nurse practitioner isn't there, although the package is. But when they open it up, they don't find a living hybrid. Instead, they find a note that says, "Out of hybrids." And Dr. Singh starts freaking out a little bit. Then they notice that the freezer door is open. And that's an issue because that's where they were hiding the body of Karen. And the fact that the freezer door was left open when Dr. Singh knows that he closed it and the nurse practitioner is missing, it's got them a little worried. When both Dr. Singh and Ronnie go to get out of there, that's when the neighborhood converges on the doctor's office. Because that nurse practitioner did in fact notice the dead body, and she went telling everybody. But Dr. Singh thinks fast on his feet and says, "I didn't want to tell you guys this, but she got sick." And one of the neighbors says, "Why didn't you just tell us that? This neighborhood is built on trust." But Dr. Singh says, "No, it's not. It's built on hypocrisy. How many neighbors have we killed together? How much gasoline is it going to take for us to realize that things are not normal?" And they're never going to be. After this speech, though, Ronnie starts coughing, and suddenly all the neighbors notice that she's looking in rough shape. And as the neighborhood puts their masks on and grabs both Dr. Singh and Ronnie, Dr. Singh is trying to plead his case that she's not contagious, although they're not listening. They take both Dr. Singh and Ronnie back to their house, they tie him up in a chair, and they light it on fire. And Dr. Singh starts apologizing for bringing the virus home to Ronnie because he must have gotten it at the hospital, but Ronnie says, "It was never you. I got it at a party. One of our neighbor's kids was coughing on me. It was never you." They start, though, saying their goodbyes because the house is quickly going up in flames, but then all of a sudden, they hear gunshots outside, and a bunch of last men come bursting through the door, putting the fire out. And right behind those modern-day firefighters is General Abbott, who walks through and says, "Dr. Singh, I presume." And then finally, over at the preserve, it's going great. Amy and Wendy have really collected this family of hybrids. And they have strict rules. When they get a new hybrid, Amy tells the person to leave it in a designated location and they'll go pick the hybrid up. They don't accept visitors because they just can't be trusted. And if the person isn't willing to meet those demands, then they don't pick the hybrid up. Wendy, though, is a little frustrated because most of the hybrids are more animal than human. She, on the other hand, is more human than animal. So she feels like she doesn't really connect with them. And Amy sits Wendy down and says, "You are perfect just the way you are." This pep talk, though, is interrupted when Bobby comes burrowing through with a ribbon. And he tells both Amy and Wendy that he found it at the fence. And when they go to investigate, it's clear to Amy that the fence has been marked by the last men. And in episode 6, that train is quickly approaching and it leaves Gus, Bear, and Tommy sprinting looking for a way on. Gus and Bear are able to find a way on, but Tommy is having trouble keeping up with the train. And both Gus and Bear head to the caboose of the train, imploring Tommy to hop on. Tommy harnesses that old football player and dives, narrowly grabbing onto the last part of the train and climbing up. And when they enter the train, they notice that this isn't just a normal train. There are no passengers. It's outfitted for just the staff and the staff only. So they start looking throughout the train and it's just full of a bunch of supplies. And to kill time, Bear shows Gus all of the wildlife that they're passing. With most humans killed off, suddenly the Midwest looks a lot like Africa with elephants, zebras, giraffes. Bear then suggests that they play a game of I Spy, and she starts teaching Gus how to play it, saying that she used to play it when she was Gus's age all the time. Her baby sister loved it even though her baby sister didn't really understand it. And Gus says to her, "I had no idea you had a sister. You must miss her a lot." And in fact, Bear does. To make her feel better, Gus lets her know, "I miss Pubba too." He then starts telling Bear all about the dream that he had when he fell, meeting Pubba, and how Pubba made him Dog for his birthday. Bear asks to see Dog, but when Gus looks in his bag, Dog is missing. He's beside himself, and they try to calm him down, saying, "It must have fallen somewhere in the train. Don't worry, we'll find it." But before the three of them can look through the train for Dog, they hear somebody coming, and they're forced to hide. It looks to be just a maintenance man on the train, and he doesn't seem to have a clue that they're there. But then Gus drops something out of his bag, and that tips off the guy that there are stowaways on the train. He ends up finding Gus and grabbing him, and that's when Tommy leaps into action fighting the guy off. And both Tommy and this railroad worker start swinging haymakers at each other. They're both really big guys. But then suddenly they recognize each other because they used to be teammates in pro football. Tommy a defensive tackle, this guy a defensive end. So suddenly they go from fighting to hugging it out, catching up. Tommy then introduces Bear to his old teammate, Jimmy. Both Tommy and Jimmy continue to catch up, but then all of a sudden, Bear and Tommy notice that Gus is nowhere to be found, and they get really worried when they see a door open, figuring that Gus must have continued onto the train looking for Dog. Tommy, Bear, and Jimmy start making their way through the train looking for Gus. Throughout this process, Bear notices that they're hauling a lot of candy bars. But while there's tons of candy bars, Gus is nowhere to be found. Jimmy makes an offhanded comment to Tommy saying, "Your boy's quite the troublemaker, huh? I think Louisa was still pregnant the last time that I saw you." And you can tell that Tommy gets pretty upset by this comment, and he cuts Jimmy off and says, "Gus is not my kid." Jimmy then asks Tommy what happened to Louisa and the baby, and Tommy has to tell him they're gone. Jimmy says, "Sorry, T. Did the sick get him?" But Tommy doesn't answer that question. And then he asks him, "What's up with the deer kid?" And Tommy says, "He's just a kid. I'm trying to help." And Jimmy says, "That doesn't sound like the Jep I remember. The Jep I remember was all about himself." But as the two are discussing this, all of a sudden, Gus comes out of nowhere. He lets Tommy know that he looked far and wide for Dog and he couldn't find him. Tommy promises to get him another one, but Gus says, "You don't understand. Papa made Dog out of his own socks. It even still smells like him." Tommy doesn't really know how to answer that, but luckily for him, he notices outside of the window that they've just passed into Colorado. And he shows Gus, and that does boost his spirits. Tommy just says aloud, "All we have to figure out now is where the hell Go-Grow is." And luckily, Jimmy knows where Go-Grow is. He opens up his itinerary and says, "It's short for Gosgrove, but nobody calls it that. They all call it Go-Grove. It's a neighborhood right outside Essex City." And luckily for them, that's the next stop. But then Bear comes back. She was looking all over for Gus, and while she didn't find Gus, what she did find was a bunch of last men, and they're coming up train. Tommy looks at Jimmy like, "Dude, what the hell? Why didn't you tell me?" And Jimmy, who is clearly dealing with some CTE, says, "I thought I told you. This is their charter. They're moving operations south, including the candy bars." Bear wants to fight him off, but Tommy says, "No, we don't know how many there are." And that's when Jimmy says, "Follow me." He continues to lead them down train until there's nowhere else to go. And Jimmy says, "I'll just tell them that nobody's here. They'll believe me." But Tommy says, "You're not exactly convincing." Bear says their only option is to jump, and it looks like that is indeed the case. But then, as the last men, who are in the very next car, start looking through it, Tommy notices through the window that Dog is in that car. And he's not willing to let Gus jump off this train without Dog. So he puts on a last man hat, an armband, and heads in to grab Dog, where obviously he's caught. He tries to play it off like he's the last man, but he had no idea that he's wanted, and they have his poster, so they recognize him. He barely makes his way to the last train, and him and Jimmy are holding off the last man. And Tommy tells Bear, "Take Gus, go." But both Gus and Bear say, "We're not leaving you. We're all going to Colorado together." And that's when Jimmy decides that he's going to sacrifice himself for the betterment of this group. He says goodbye to his old buddy, and the trio hop off the train. And Jimmy is left to fight off 4 or 5 last men by himself. And he does a pretty good job. Gus, Bear, and Tommy start making their way to Go-Grove. And Tommy tells Bear, "I know you're heading down south, but if you want to tag along with us, you can." And Bear smiles and says, "I'll think about it." But then Gus starts freaking out because they've arrived at Essex County. And that means they're not far from Go-Grove. Over with Dr. Singh, it wasn't like General Abbott was there to save him. He was strictly there for the book. And after he finds it, he's heading out the door, leaving Dr. Singh and Ronnie to just sit there, tied up, and die. And that's when Ronnie says, "If you let us die, you'll never have the cure." And that gets General Abbott to stop dead in his tracks. General Abbott then notices that Ronnie's finger is twitching, and Dr. Singh says she's not contagious, but General Abbott still covers his mouth. He then realizes that this must be the Jane Doe that Dr. Singh talks about in his research, the woman that he's experimenting on. He then has Dr. Singh tell him about this cure, and Dr. Singh makes up a lie that is extremely believable, telling General Abbott, "It's not in that book. I have it. And in order to get it, you have to let us both go." Abbott then yells for a soldier named Johnny to come help both Dr. Singh and Ronnie pack because they're going to be moving them to, quote, better accommodations. He then whispers in Johnny's ear, "Don't screw this up." And it's obvious that Johnny has screwed stuff up in the past because he's got a mullet. In front of Johnny, though, Dr. Singh is freaking out a little bit. He yells at Ronnie, "What are we going to do about Trixie, their horse?" They're never going to let us bring her. And as Johnny is munching on Dr. Singh's Pop-Tarts, he says, "Who's Trixie?" And that's when Dr. Singh asks, "Can me and my wife have a moment alone?" He asks Ronnie, "How on earth am I going to find a cure for the sick? Everyone's been looking for a cure for the last 10 years. And Ronnie says, "I don't know, but what I do know is we have more time together now than we did this morning." They then pack up the rest of their stuff. They have hoods put over their heads, and they're loaded up into a van. And as they're leaving their cul-de-sac, Johnny whispers in Dr. Singh's ear, "I let your horse go. It's free." And Dr. Singh thanks him for that. And finally, at the preserve, Amy thought she had way more time than this before the last men found him. She's trying to figure out what to do. She knows that if she takes the ribbons off, then that'll give a clear indication that someone is there. So she's kind of hoping that they just see them and they keep moving, not inspecting the area much. She tells Bobby, "Go check the tunnels, but whatever you do, don't get caught." She puts the entire zoo in lockdown, and she's freaking out a little bit, but then she realizes that she has to stay strong for Wendy. She promises Wendy, "Nothing will happen to you." But then Wendy can smell that there are people outside, and when they check the security camera, in fact, there is a last man just standing there. At this point, Amy knows she has to get the preserve to safety. She has Wendy and the rest of the hybrids pack up their stuff and head through underground tunnels. Amy then goes through the plan with Wendy, which is to follow the pipes, hide in the church, protect the others, and wait until Amy comes for them. Wendy then notices that Amy isn't coming with them, and she says, "Why aren't you coming?" And Amy says, "I have to stay behind in case the bad men come." Wendy's worried, though, that she messes things up, and Amy says, "You won't, because you're Wendy. You're strong. You're my daughter. Now go." But before she does, Wendy makes Amy promise that she'll return for them, and Amy does. She then hugs Wendy, but then locks the tunnel closed, heading back up to the preserve and waiting with a gun in her lap for the 3 last men who are outside of the fence to come in. In episode 7, you get some backstory on how Birdie and Gus's dad met. Gus's dad worked at a science lab, and Birdie also worked there too, but they had much different jobs. Gus's dad was the janitor, and Birdie was a legit scientist. Gus's dad had noticed Birdie around, and one night he's sitting in a bar just kind of hanging out when Birdie comes in. And he had noticed earlier in the day that something wasn't sitting right with Birdie, because usually she's really excited, she's in a good mood. But that day, she just looked annoyed. They start striking up a conversation, and they bond over the fact that they love the Grateful Dead. That leads into what Birdie was so upset about, and it was the fact that she's being taken off the project that she devoted over a year to. And when Gus's dad, whose real name is Richard, asks, "What is the project? Can you tell me?" She explains that the project focused on creating vaccines. She went looking for a microbe that nobody knew existed, and she was able to find it in Alaska. She explains that some microbes make you sick, but others make you better, and that's what you create vaccines from. What she was doing is injecting chicken eggs with the microbes that she found. If you incubate the right eggs, you can grow vaccines, but if you mess up, things can go wrong fast. The bartender then announces that it's last call, so the two get out of there, and they walk to Birdie's house, and they're enjoying each other's company, getting ready to hook up, when all of a sudden Birdie gets a phone call letting her know that the military is at the lab, and they're confiscating everything. A woman named Judy hid her project in a storage unit, and she needs to get to the lab ASAP to get it before the military finds it. Luckily for her, since Richard is the janitor, he has the keys to the place. So they head there and covertly make their way inside, and they see all the military taking this stuff out, and Birdie's freaking out a little bit. She finally reached the storage closet where Judy hid her project, but before she shows Richard what it is, she wants to explain some things. She tells him that the microbe that she told him about, well, they accidentally created a miracle, and that miracle is Gus. And she wants to get Gus out of there before he's discovered, because she knows that if the military finds Gus, they're going to dissect him, experiment on him. She doesn't want that life for him. The military, though, is right outside the door, and Richard says, "I'll create a distraction." He does that by acting like he's just a routine maintenance man vacuuming, and that gives Birdie enough time to grab Gus and get out of there. Richard links up with Birdie down in the basement, but Birdie's not coming with. She gives Gus to Richard and says, "I have to go back. I have to either get my research or burn this place to the ground, because everything we've been doing in the wrong hands is going to kill millions of people." Richard, though, just met Birdie like 4 hours ago, and he's definitely not ready to be a father. But she tells him, because you're so unassuming, they're not going to come for you. Alarms start going off in the building, and Birdie tells Richard, "I'll find you," and then she heads back in. A couple weeks later, the pandemic hits, and that's when Richard took Gus to Yellowstone. Now, present-day Gus is about a mile outside of Go Grove, But the closer that they're getting, the more he's talking about meeting up with his mother. It's becoming an issue for both Bear and Jep. They don't know how to break the news to him that his mom is probably dead. Tommy suggests that Bear take Gus with her down south. She had told both Tommy and Gus that she was heading down south to link up with some other hybrid-saving people. Although when Tommy brings that up, it becomes apparent that that might not be true. She's heard rumors that there are people down south, and she was thinking about going there, but when the opportunity to lead them to the train popped up, she took it. As they're discussing, though, what the plan is going to be and how to let Gus down gently, Gus ends up noticing that there's smoke coming out of a house, and that house is the address of Birdie. And Gus gets really excited. He starts knocking on the door, but when the woman answers, it's not Birdie. It's a woman named Judy. Although she quickly recognizes Gus and cannot believe that he's still alive. She invites the trio in and she explains that she used to work with Birdie and Birdie actually saved her life. Unfortunately, though, Birdie no longer lives there. She took off 10 years ago claiming that she was going to find Gus, and Judy hasn't heard from her since. Gus is pretty defeated about this, but then he notices a pot that says Fort Smith Labs, and he recognizes that name because it was in the lockbox that he found under the tree, and he pulls out from his bag his dad's old ID badge. Judy explains that Fort Smith was the place that they worked. His mom was a scientist. And when he shows Judy Richards' badge, she's pretty surprised. She then gets up, goes to a safe, and pulls out a key. She tells Gus that the key opens up the attic. Birdie had given it to Judy to keep safe in case anyone came, but Judy figures that Birdie would want him to see it. So Gus immediately runs up to the attic. The name Fort Smith, though, does ring a bell with both Bear and Tommy. And Bear says to him that place is rumored to be where the Six started. They also think that Judy knows way more than she's letting on. Something isn't adding up to the two. Either way, though, they follow Gus up to the attic. He's looking around at all the stuff. And Jep feels like this is the best time to let Gus down. But Gus cuts him off and says, I heard you guys talking earlier, and I know what you're going to say. You guys think this is a waste of time, but you're wrong. You guys never expected us to get this far, but look where we are. I'm in my mom's house. So just because you guys have given up doesn't mean I have to. And that quiets both Bear and Tommy up. But then Bear notices what Judy was implying that Gus should see. It's a bunch of files from Fort Smith. And Gus is named Gus because the project was called the Genetic Unit Series. And in those files, Gus finds out the truth. That Birdie wasn't his actual biological mother, Gus was made, and he does not handle the truth well at all. The usually optimistic Gus gets really angry. Bear tries to calm him down, explaining that she was adopted, but her adoptive parents were her parents, just because they weren't her biological parents. Gus, though, doesn't want to hear any of this. He feels like his entire life has been a lie. He sprints out of the house and heads to the nearest woods. And then finally, in the season finale, Abbott's troops converge on the preserve as Wendy and the other hybrids try to make it to the church. Before they actually go into the preserve, Abbott gives Amy the opportunity to surrender. He hops on a bullhorn and lets her know that he knows exactly who she is. And he asks her, do you have any idea who I am? And she responds, an asshole with a tank? But he doesn't answer that, just saying, I'm the guy who's going to give you your own chapter in the history books, but how that chapter ends is up to you. He threatens her, saying that he's not leaving. She says that she's not giving up the hybrids. And finally, he gives the order for the troops to sneak into the preserve as he continues to talk to her. After explaining that it's now the hybrids' turn and that he's a dinosaur, she asks him, do you like fireworks? And he says, yeah, of course. And that's when she sets off a bunch of fireworks that she had collected in the town. These fireworks explode in some soldiers' faces, but it creates enough of a distraction for Amy to get out of there. When Abbott and his men finally do enter the preserve, Amy's long gone. She heads to the church, but unfortunately, her kids aren't there. It started with Bobby. He was the first to be seen by the soldiers, and then Wendy was caught, and then the rest of them. All of the kids are rounded up and taken back to the preserve where Abbott and his men have set up shop. And this just so happens to be where Dr. Singh and Ronnie were taken to. They show up at the preserve, and Dr. Singh is separated from Ronnie. Even though he claims that Ronnie is not contagious, Abbott says, you can't be too careful. Abbott tells Singh, you're going to have everything at this place that you could want to find a cure. And Singh yells, I want my wife. Obviously, Abbott meant you can have everything but that. Abbott tells Dr. Singh that there's a new wave of the sick coming. The previous doctor predicted it, and he's hearing that that prediction is coming true in other areas of the world. So he is going to need the cure. Dr. Singh nervously tells him, I never guaranteed that I could, make one. And Abbott laughs, saying, I know, you were bluffing to save yourselves, duh. But you're to find me a cure with enough doses so I can decide who lives and who doesn't. And finding a cure means experimenting on hybrids. Now, not too far away, Bear and Jep need to go after Gus. Tommy tells Bear, I'll do it, because somebody needs to stay here just in case he does come back. So Tommy goes off to try to find Gus. Bear, on the other hand, sits back with Judy. And Bear starts looking through some of Birdie's old research and finds a satellite phone, although it's dead. When Judy comes up to the attic to get some porch lights, Bear asks, how did you make Gus? And Judy says, Gus was all Birdie. But Fort Smith wasn't just about Gus. And Bear says, yeah, I know. It was about the virus too, wasn't it? But Judy doesn't want to answer that, just saying, well, what does it matter now? And Bear gets real specific, asking, what does the virus have to do with kids like Gus? And Judy is a little hesitant to tell Bear anything, but eventually she says, Birdie once told me that they were two sides of the same coin, but other than that, she wasn't willing to tell me much. Bear and Judy then head downstairs, and Bear starts trying to figure out a way to charge the satellite phone. As she's doing it, Judy asks her, what's your name? I know it's not Bear. What's your real name? And Bear tells Judy that her name's Becky. She's always said that her foster parents were murdered by the last men, but in reality, they just died from the sick. When that happened, though, soldiers came and took her little sister, who was a hybrid. And she's looked for her sister for years, but eventually she just gave up. She didn't really have anywhere to go, and finally she met somebody like her, a like-minded individual that she called Tiger. And that was her family, until Tiger betrayed her. He tells her, if Gus can make it back here after all these years, you never know what you can find if you look hard enough. And ain't that the truth? Because Becky's sister that she'd been searching for her entire life is actually Wendy. Now, as Becky and Judy discuss the past, Tommy went searching for Gus. Gus had wandered all the way to a downed plane in a field, and that plane was actually used to drop pamphlets promoting the preserve. When Tommy finally finds Gus, Gus is just sitting there. And the first thing he does is hand him Dog and tell him that if you lose that thing, you'll regret it for the rest of your life. He tells him that he needs to keep that stuff because it's all that he has from his dad. And Gus asks, what dad? I don't have one. In fact, I don't have anyone. It's just me. Tommy tells Gus that Richard did his best. And if there's a bright side of this, is the fact that all that stuff in the attic tells him that one thing he said was true. Gus is a special kid. Gus fires back, I don't want to be special. I want to be like everybody else. I want to be with kids like me. He said that there were kids like me. He then tells Tommy that he's going to go to the preserve because he's sick of being the weird one. Tommy then tells Gus a story that he's never told him before. Doesn't seem like Tommy's told anyone this story before. Back when the world was going to shit, Tommy and his wife had a baby, and all Tommy wanted was for the baby to be normal. He did not want a hybrid. But when the nurse finally came and found him and told him that his wife had had a child, and he went to go check on his son, he saw that his child was half human, half... It looked like a donkey or a horse or a cow. Somebody will correct me. But it ruined Tommy. He had a little bit of a meltdown, running to the closest elevator and trying to get out of there. And in a weird twist, in that same elevator was Dr. Singh, who asked him, what is it? And all Tommy could say was, I don't know. It was just one of those things. He then told Dr. Singh, I don't know if I can do this. And Dr. Singh was able to snap him out of it, saying, you'll be surprised what you're capable of when it's for somebody that you love. Dr. Singh then told him good luck and got off the elevator. And instead of leaving, Tommy decided to go back up to the maternity ward. But when he got there, soldiers had taken his child and his wife, and he never saw them again. He then looks at Gus and says, don't make me lose you too. Come back with me. Gus asks where and what would they do, and Tommy says, we'll go wherever we want. We'll do whatever we want. Gus asks them together, and Jep says, why do you think I'm here? He then asks if Bear can come too, and Tommy says, we'll discuss that. They both laugh about it, and then Gus says, so what should we say to the preserve when they get here? Because, and I don't want you to get mad, I kind of called them, and they said they were on their way. And he points to the radio that was in the downed plane. All of a sudden, a gunshot goes off, and Tommy hits the floor because he's been shot, and the, quote, people from the preserve show up. In reality, they're Abbott's men. They grab Gus, they put him in a cage, and they take him back to the preserve. Gus is wheeled in, and he's actually supposed to be the first one to be experimented on by Dr. Singh. He's reminding himself, don't let them know you can talk. Do not let them know you can talk, over and over again. And as he's doing this, Dr. Singh is putting in a voice recording how he's about to do something that he swore he would never do. He then takes the tarp off of Gus's cage, and he can't believe how old Gus is. He then notices, though, that Gus is eyeing up his candy bar. So he goes over, grabs the candy bar, gives it to Gus, and then Gus says, thank you. And Singh is absolutely shocked. Johnny comes in and lets him know that General Abbott is waiting for him. But Dr. Singh isn't about to cut Gus open. He tells him, bring me another one. I need more time with this one. And Johnny tries to tell him, General Abbott's not going to like that, but Dr. Singh yells at him, he's not going to know because you're not going to tell him. Now bring me another one. Johnny then grabs another hybrid and takes Gus to the stables where they kept the horses. And at the stables, Gus ends up meeting Wendy and all of her friends. They give him a big giant hug, and finally, he feels like he's among his own kind. Dr. Singh is forced to cut open a living hybrid, and even though he really doesn't want to, he goes through it anyway. Now, Amy isn't too far away, and she had been monitoring what Abbott's troops were doing via radio. So when she heard that they had shot somebody, she drove out to the field and picked Jep up. Jep wakes up in a room, doesn't know where he is, holding Dog, and he says, what's going on? Who are you? And Amy tells him, you should take it easy. I need you to heal up because tomorrow we get our kids back. And then finally, Bear was able to get that satellite phone charged and turned on. And she called the number on it. And it rang and rang and rang. And finally, somebody in Alaska named Birdie picks up. And that is the end of season 1 of Sweet Tooth. I can't tell you how much I loved this show. Truly one of my favorite shows Netflix has done. You didn't come here, though, for my review. You came here for a recap. Hit subscribe. Hit thumbs up if you liked it. Smash that thumbs down button if you thought it sucked. I have merch. Go buy a mug or a shirt or something. There's birthdays coming up, I'm sure, in your life. Christmas is right around the corner. Be nice in the comments section and share it on your social media pages.